the RTX 4090. I'm gonna go straight out and say it. This is what Ampere should have been, but it's still too expensive. I guess that sums up the bulk of this content, along with both of these cards here just being monumentally huge. And you thought the 3090 Ti was big. But there is actually a lot to talk about and a lot of games to look at. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Yeah. You looking for performance? Well, have I got the goods for you. This bad boy has everything you need, and it comes in up to 2 terabytes. So size isn't a problem. Also, forget about SATA or those super slow hard drives, as it's PCIe Gen 4 for blazing fast speeds. And this baby is M.2, so you can attach it directly to your motherboard. No hassle, no extra wires. This is the best around. You interested? Find out more by clicking the link in the description below. So Nvidia's RTX Ampere-based GPUs were originally launched in September 2020, with the RTX 3080 being the flagship card. And as time went on, we started to see the rest of the stack emerge, right down to the pitiful RTX 3050, which was overpriced for the performance, and up to the RTX 3090 Ti, which was kind of beyond reach for most, let's call them, average gaming consumers. Now, along with the RTX 3090, it was aimed at 8K gaming, though that wasn't really a thing, and still actually isn't. And in my opinion, was more of a kind of Titan type card that was being sold as a gaming card. Now, don't get me wrong, they can game, and very, very well. But with the 3090 Ti being priced at $1,999, it was just a bit too much. And I think it was clear from the media like ourselves and gamers that they would have been happy with the performance levels from these cards if only they were a bit cheaper. So that brings us to today. RTX 30 series prices have fallen, quite dramatically in some cases, but people are reluctant to buy them for many different reasons. And one of those reasons comes down to the release of the RTX 4090 and the Ada Lovelace family that is due to join it in the coming months. This time around, Nvidia have gone slightly differently to previous launches, instead releasing what is, or could be, the theoretical flagship, unless a 4090 Ti variant comes at a later date. And just from our testing and kind of general feel of the GPU, it feels like this is what Ampere should have been. Or a better way to describe it is that Ampere now feels like more of a testing ground for what was always going to come along, because the performance on the RTX 4090 is frankly ridiculous. So let's talk about specs and how things compare generation to generation. Not only have we seen the process size shrink from 8nm to 4nm, we've also seen a huge increase in transistor count, along with a very impressive 52% increase in CUDA cores, Tensor cores, and RT cores when compared to the 3090 Ti. So even though from a first glance it still has 24GB of VRAM and it still uses a 384-bit bus, there's a lot more changes under the hood. So memory aside, we have a card that compared to the Ampere flagship packs 52% more cores, whether they be for pure rasterization, ray tracing, or AI-based super sampling. And on paper, comes with a 43% faster base clock speed and a boost clock that has also seen a 35% uplift. Now the other thing to mention is the memory speed, which has also been increased ever so slightly, but by less than 1%, it kind of, at such a small amount, it's not exactly something worth talking about. Now the big thing to talk about though is if these huge gains amount to anything, and if that makes it worth its $1,599 price tag or not, especially considering you can now pick up a 3090 Ti in various forms for anywhere upwards of $1,199. For this video, we've tested 15 games, and due to the high-end nature of the RTX 4090 and the cards it's competing against, we'll be focusing on the 4K resolution results. We do have data on other resolutions, and we'll touch on them further on in the video as well if you want to check that out. All games were tested using our Intel Core i9 12900K based test system on the Asus Z690 Maximus Hero motherboard, with 32GB of Patriot Viper Venom 6200MHz memory. Resizable bar was enabled for all GPUs, and all Nvidia based cards were tested using the latest 521.90 driver, while the AMD GPUs were tested using the latest 22.10.1 driver, and all benchmarks were run on the latest update of Windows 11. Also, while we're showing as much as we can here, there's a bit more data over on eTeknix.com, where we have written articles and all of the testing data, including other resolutions, are available over on our Patreon. That link is down below. So starting things off with some synthetic benchmarks, and in Timespy Extreme things get off to a flying start, where we see a huge 50% uplift in the overall score and an even larger 69% improvement in the graphics score on both the Gigabyte and MSI 4090 cards when compared to the Gigabyte RTX 3090 Ti. In Port Royal, we again see some huge gains of up to 72% in both the score and overall FPS for the MSI Suprim X model, with the Gigabyte sitting just behind when looking at the gains compared to the Ampere flagship. In our last synthetic test, we're taking a look at the PugetBench for Davinci Resolve, which gives us both standard and extended scores. And in the standard test, we see a 17% uplift in performance when looking at the 3090 Ti and moving up to both the Gigabyte Gaming OC and MSI Suprim X models. While the extended test shows a similar result with a 16% increase in performance over the 3090 Ti. So moving on to our first game, an Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where we see the Gigabyte card pushing ahead of the MSI by around 2 FPS, which then puts it 43% faster than the 3090 Ti in the overall averages, and around 34% faster in the 1% lows at 4K. Call of Duty Warzone saw a similar gain of 51% when looking at the performance gain on the MSI Suprim X card compared to that of the 3090 Ti. And when looking at the 6900 XT from the competition, that gain increases further to 55% in pure rasterization. The improvements get even larger in control at 4K, where the RTX 4090 flies ahead of the 3090 Ti by just over 60% in the averages, and then also holds a steady 53% lead in the 1% lows at well over 100 frames per second. The gains keep on coming, where in Cyberpunk we finally see a card that's actually able to handle frame rates above 60 FPS in 4K on the Ultra preset. And that shows that the 4090 is now between 42 and 46% faster than the 3090 Ti. Death Stranding sees a similar 42% lead on the MSI Suprim X model, while the Gigabyte still enjoys a 38% uplift when comparing both to the 3090 Ti. In terms of the gain over the 6900 XT, we still see between around a 50% lead from both models of 4090 that we tested here today. Dying Light 2 is an intensive game, but the RTX 4090 makes light work of it, offering up over 100 FPS at 4K on the high DX12 preset, and pushing over 64% more performance than that of the 3090 Ti, and a frankly laughable 86% improvement over the 6900 XT. Ouch. F122 sees a smaller 34% margin going from the 3090 Ti to the 4090 Gaming OC, and a slightly larger 37% increase when comparing to the 4090 Suprim X, while the hurt just keeps on coming, where the 4090 from MSI comes in 48% faster than the 6900 XT, and we've not even got to ray tracing yet. No surprises with FarCry 6 with the HD textures installed on the Ultra preset, where at 4K we continue to see a large 43% improvement over the 3090 Ti from both 4090 models, while that lead increases to 39% over the AMD current generation flagship. Fornite saw some very interesting results as the lead dropped ever so slightly, but still seeing a 25% improvement over the last generation's flagship. Well, that's nothing really to grumble about. But where things are really harsh is in the 1% lows. But thankfully this is consistent across all cards tested and not just the 4090s. Forza Horizon 5 saw some pretty solid gains of around 34%, with the Gigabyte Gaming OC card just pulling ahead of the MSI model, and with some better 1% lows as well. When comparing to the 6900 XT, we again see a healthy gain of 42% in performance overall, but we'll add for an interesting comparison based on cost to performance. The RTX 4090 ended up 40% faster than the 3090 Ti in Horizon Zero Dawn, which is impressive, but the real talking point here is how the MSI Suprim X model comes in 100% faster than the 6900 XT on ultimate quality. I am almost speechless at this point. Spider-Man was an interesting one because we did see another strong leap in performance of around 50% when comparing both 4090 cards to the 3090 Ti. But even at 4K, it did show that we were potentially being limited by a 12900K, which frankly sounds ridiculous. But the RTX 4090 is that good that we ended up seeing similar performance results across all three resolutions, which we'll be posting up on our Patreon if you want to check that out. The other major thing to talk about is the 79% improvement over the 6950 XT, which almost makes it seem laughable at this point. Microsoft Flight Sim was another title that threw up some anomalies across multiple resolutions, all seeing around 64 frames per second at all three resolutions, again leading to a potential CPU bottleneck issue. That aside, it still gave us a 19% improvement over the 3090 Ti. However, the biggest talking point again is looking at the 84% gain over the 6950 XT. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we again see some really solid numbers, with the MSI Suprim X edging ahead of the Gigabyte card, albeit by 1%. While it does manage to push 66% ahead of the 3090 Ti and 82% ahead of the 6950 XT. Finally, in Watch Dogs Legion, we again see a 57% performance boost over the 3090 Ti, with the Gigabyte card edging slightly ahead of the Suprim X, and also seeing a 63% uplift in performance over the 6950 XT. So, some very interesting data and a lot to talk about. Firstly, I'm kind of blown away because Nvidia claimed to have a performance uplift of such a high amount, and generally speaking, it's always a bit of a hot air statement because we see slides demonstrating this and demonstrating that, and it's normally favoured to Nvidia titles, or the results have been specifically selected to show them in the best light. And I get that, because AMD and Intel do exactly the same as well. And I guess that's what keeps us reviewers in work, because we can offer up unbiased results and opinions based on our own testing. Now, because there is so much to go through, the easiest thing to do is to actually look at the 15 game averages across the cards, which will give us kind of a much clearer picture of where things are positioned. Taking a look at the overall frame rate averages, and at 1080p we see some pretty decent results, with the Gigabyte Gaming OC 4090 coming in around 13% faster than the 3090 Ti and 10% faster than the 6900 XT. While the MSI improves on that further, pushing 15% faster than the 3090 Ti and an 11% faster gain than the 6900 XT. While these are impressive, running a GPU like this at 1080p really does show how you'd be CPU bound overall, and we'll start to see some restrictions in performance due to the GPU being so powerful. At 1440p, the bottleneck of the CPU is still there, but does alleviate ever so slightly, where we see both RTX 4090s push ahead of the 3090 Ti by around 23%, and further cements its lead over the 6900 XT by a 30% margin. Then at 4K, which is where I think anyone buying a 4090 is actually looking, we see a clear 43% performance improvement when looking between the 3090 Ti Gaming OC and the 4090 Gaming OC, while the MSI Suprim X increases that performance gap to 44% over the 3090 Ti. Now, when compared to the competition, the 4090 actually comes in 49% faster overall than the 6950 XT, and a whopping 68% faster than the 6900 XT. But obviously cost will play a factor too, which we will actually, look at shortly. Before we do, it's actually worth looking at ray tracing performance as well, because it's kind of one of the main reasons why you'd buy Nvidia over the competition. And with, again, such bold claims when it comes to performance coming from the green team, it's definitely one of the most interesting talking points of the RTX 4090. So looking at control, we can see that the performance took a 37% decrease once ray tracing was enabled, but enabling DLSS and utilising the 1440p resolution to upscale from actually allowed performance to dramatically gain by 87%. Now, the most interesting talking point here is that with ray tracing enabled and DLSS on, you now have a visually stunning looking game with a 16% kind of uplift in performance than with ray tracing off. On top of this, those new RT cores really do a great job, which sees a 47% uplift when compared to the 3090 Ti when just ray tracing is enabled, and a 59% uplift compared to the 3090 Ti when looking at performance with ray tracing and DLSS both enabled. Moving on to Cyberpunk, and I want to choose my words carefully, because while we did see a 45% decrease when enabling ray tracing, the more important thing to notice is that enabling DLSS sees us with Cyberpunk at 4K on the Ultra preset with ray tracing set to Ultra, getting 78 frames per second from our MSI card. This is almost like the stuff that dreams are made of. But the comparison gets even better, because by my calculations, we actually lose only 0.9% when going from Cyberpunk with no ray tracing to Cyberpunk with ray tracing and DLSS enabled. And with DLSS 3 available on the 40 series cards, something that we could go into for hours. So we will actually be creating more content solely focused on the even bigger results that it has to offer. Finally, in Watch Dogs Legion, we see a 39% decrease in performance to get those shiny reflections, which frankly looks awesome in the game, to only seeing a 4.2% decrease from the original pure rasterization result to having ray tracing and DLSS set to quality. Compared to the 3090 Ti with Ray Tracing and DLSS enabled, we now see a 55% performance gain when moving up to the 4090. Again, the stuff that dreams are made of. So pretty impressive stuff. I mean, who am I kidding? It's pretty damn crazy seeing these huge gains in performance. And while I get that not everyone is keen on DLSS and the way it kind of does things, even at 4K, it just looks simply stunning. And not having these kind of huge hits in performance now is just next level stuff. Now, as you saw, we've got two cards here today. So it is worth giving some information on each of them, and we will have kind of more content on them individually as time goes on. So firstly, the Gigabyte Gaming OC. Now, I'm a big fan of the Gigabyte Gaming OC cards. They generally offer a little more performance than a reference spec card and hit that comfortable middle ground of performance from both the GPU itself and the cooling performance, which we will actually get to shortly. Now, I'd be lying if I didn't say that it was a huge card, but anyone who's had a 3090 or 3090 Ti will be kind of used to similar size cards anyway. And this just goes a little further and weighs a ton as well at 2,285 grams. It includes the 3 DisplayPorts and single HDMI that is part of the Nvidia spec, so no crazy changes there. And when comparing to the previous generation gaming OC, the fans have actually got a little bit bigger, and the RGB is tied to the fan speed by default, which is kind of cool as it means it won't be distracting when not gaming, but it's quite volatile when going kind of full pelt. But of course, it can all be controlled through Gigabyte software. Now, my only gripe with the gaming OC, and it may be a pre-production issue, but the plastic shroud just feels a bit cheaper than what it was on the 3090 Ti, but hopefully that will be addressed in the retail version. Now, we will also have a dedicated video on that card in the near future when we're kind of, have the ability to go into a bit more detail, so definitely subscribe so you don't miss that. Now, in terms of the MSI Suprim X, MSI have kind of stepped up their game and actually sidestepped in other areas. A lot of the changes are branding specific or superficial, so it's not like big changes are happening that the consumer will appreciate from a performance standpoint. But aesthetically, it's beautiful. It comes in quite a bit heavier than the Gigabyte at 2,750 grams, and again, sees the card itself a fair bit chunkier than the previous generation 30 series Suprim X cards. The RGB has been toned down somewhat, and by default the card simply pulses white, which actually makes the card feel less gamery and more premium to a certain degree. And that same premium feeling spans across the card, the anti-sag bracket, and the packaging in general. You can kind of tell that MSI had some discussions and came back with something to rival the high-end premium segment of the market. So cooling wise, we did see slightly higher temperatures on the MSI card at 74 degrees on the hotspot, while the Gigabyte card came in slightly lower at 71 degrees. Now, these are both a little higher than the 3090 Ti, which came in at 70 degrees, but still falls well below any kind of cause for concern. I guess that the new TSMC 4nm process really does help, given the extra performance. Could you imagine if this was still using Samsung's 8nm process? Toasty. Thermals to one side, the acoustics were pretty reasonable, with the MSI coming in at 40 decibels during load, while the Gigabyte card came in slightly higher at 45 decibels, but both fall within what I'd personally class as reasonable limits. So the big one, power usage. There's been a lot of talk about Ada Lovelace power spiking to stupidly high levels and needing further kind of higher wattage power supplies to run them. But before we get into the power, it's worth noting that the Nvidia reference spec is 450 watts, and the Gigabyte Gaming OC card conforms to that, while the MSI is rated in gaming mode and not silent mode to go above that to 480 watts. But during our testing, we actually found an issue affecting multiple SKUs of cards, including MSI and Asus cards that were showing restrictive power limits of 450 watts. Sadly, after creating this content, MSI are actually taking this card away from us to rotate it around to other media, but we will definitely look to see about potentially retesting the card when it comes back to see if any performance metrics actually change. But in our opinion, the difference would be deemed in the same realm as kind of margin of error, which is around 1 to 2%. So nothing really to worry about, but it's worth noting that the card was potentially not working to its rated spec, and something I'm sure will be fixed by MSI and Nvidia in conjunction with each other. Now, in the course of our benchmarking, we saw pretty decent figures at idle, with the Gigabyte card sipping another 28% more power when compared to the RTX 3090 Ti, but actually around 4% less than our RTX 3090 Suprim X. Now, the RTX 4090 Suprim X, however, was a slightly different story, as it consumed 98% more power at idle than the RTX 3090 Ti did. Now at load across 15 games, thanks to the new TSMC 4nm process, we see some pretty decent figures, with the RTX 4090 Suprim X coming in with 18% less power draw when compared to the 3090 Ti. Now the Gigabyte card uses a little more at around 3% more power compared to the MSI version, which then gives us a slightly smaller decrease of 14% compared to the Ampere flagship. Right now, in terms of these figures, I'd be, let's say, a little cautious with the MSI figure due to the reasons I mentioned, and you could see this power draw maybe increase ever so slightly. Taking a look at performance per watt, we can see a clear distinction where the RTX 4090 just offers amazing efficiency compared to all other cards tested. Not only are they 65% more efficient compared to the 3090 Ti, but are the same when comparing against the 6950 XT and 38% more efficient than the reference 6900 XT from AMD. So power actually looks a bit better than what everyone was expecting, and for a very good reason. From our own industry insider sources, it seems that Ada Lovelace was always planned, at least from a power sense, to continue on Samsung's 8nm node. And this was all finalised at the start of 2022, because these things like that generally take time when developing a product. Where it gets a little bit muddy is shortly after, as things drew closer to the summer. From what we're hearing, that's where TSMC stepped in and started producing for Nvidia on the 4nm fabrication process. And that's why power draw is actually a lot lower than what we were anticipating. That's also why we were able to test through the Nvidia PCAT, which only has 3 8-pin power connectors on, even though our adapter, which didn't melt, actually uses 4 8-pin power connectors. As we confirmed in a video we did with Johnny Guru, each connector is technically capable of 342 watts, which is more than enough even with a large overhead. So sticking with power, another big area comes down to the cost of running the cards, especially given the price of electricity increasing across the world. And in the US, we see the MSI card at idle coming in around double that of the 3090 Ti at just over half a cent per hour. At load, you'd be looking around 5.4 cents per hour to run, which is actually around 17% cheaper per hour to run than the 3090 Ti Gaming OC, which the Gigabyte 4090 comes in around 14% cheaper to run per hour. So that's the US side of things, but in the UK, it doesn't exactly fare great for the MSI card, which will end up costing around 1.35 pence per hour just sitting on the desktop, which is actually 98% higher than the 3090 Ti, while the 4090 from Gigabyte is only 29% higher to run at idle when looking at the cost per hour. At load, it's not a cheap one, I will warn you, but electricity isn't cheap in the UK right now, with a cost coming in just under 12 pence per hour on the MSI 4090, and just over 12 pence per hour on the Gigabyte Gaming OC. Though again, I'd consider that the MSI figures may be a little bit wrong based on this, but let's call it, I don't know, a bug, and this may be fixed. Now, compared to the 3090 Ti, we obviously see the same 17% decrease in cost for the MSI and 14% for the Gigabyte. So at this point, this content is probably a lot longer than I wanted it to be. But the 4090 has given us so much to talk about, from pure rasterization, to ray tracing, to DLSS, to power, to temperatures, to bugs, and everything in between. And I feel like I've not even scratched the surface. Now, we do have a bucket load more testing to do in even more games, and to obviously look at DLSS 3, which is still in kind of a beta type stage. And without making this content longer than it needs to be, that's something that we'll be doing separately, because overall it's quite complex, and in my opinion it deserves its own content. Also, as mentioned, we may need to retest the MSI card if and kind of when it comes back to us, as MSI took it before a fix was made, so it's kind of out of our hands with that one. And yes, we did plead with them, but they had their own reasons behind it all. Now, Nvidia set out to do something important, and that was to, I guess, offer a clear and distinctive uplift in performance. And I honestly think I can say that they did that to an extremely meaningful level. Anyone on a high-end 30 series card is going to see and feel the performance increase, no matter the title or the settings. And when I joked in the past about 8K gaming on the likes of a 30 series card, I now think that's actually a viable option on the 4090. So again, maybe that's something we'll look into. The RTX 4090 feels like Nvidia came in with a 3-prong approach, which was to increase overall performance in rasterization, increase ray tracing performance, and to improve on their own AI upscaling technology, DLSS. And I can honestly give them a tick in every single box, because performance has increased across the board. And when I mentioned at the start that Ada Lovelace is kind of what Ampere should have been, I feel that's more true now after testing, because Ampere, while it's still amazingly powerful, don't get me wrong, it just feels a bit inferior. And like Nvidia have maybe even surprised themselves. So what I'm trying to say is there's a lot to celebrate. But we do also have to address the elephant in the room, and that comes down to price. We all heard the $1,599 price tag that was being pushed on the reference and FE spec models. But obviously with the two cards we have here, they aren't FE or reference spec and will demand a higher premium. And that does actually come to kind of make a difference. I mean, the Gigabyte card is coming in at £1,829 in the UK, and for the leaked Newegg pricing, $1,599 in the US. While the MSI card is again, from the leaked Newegg pricing, $1,699 in the US, and then by my own calculations, because MSI had no information for me, £1,929. I mean, it's a little higher than what I first anticipated, but it's also worth looking at the cost per frame to see if the value for money argument is kind of really there. And even with the price drops on the 3090 Ti, because the performance is so strong on these cards, we actually see a 6% increase in cost if going for the Gigabyte 4090 over the 3090 Ti in the UK, when looking at the cost per frame, which overall isn't that bad considering this is bleeding edge new technology. Of course, the MSI comes in slightly higher at around 11% more per frame than a 3090 Ti, but again, I'm not even mad, because even while benchmarking these cards, I was smiling ear to ear and surprising myself. Now in the US, the story is actually dramatically better, with the Gigabyte 4090 only costing 1.7% more per frame than a 3090 Ti, while the more expensive MSI card sits around 7% higher per frame. Sure, $1,700 is a lot to pay for a GPU, but it just feels like you get a lot for your money, and things are only going to get better as games are optimized for the tech. DLSS 3 becomes more prevalent, and any power limit bugs are, let's say, ironed out. All in all, I can honestly say I think the 4090 is one of the best GPU launches I've ever had the pleasure of being a part of. But we all know RDNA 3 is around the corner, and obviously the RTX 4080 in both 16GB and 4070 variants. If you know, you know. So what do you think? The performance is great, the price is high, but for good reason. Either way, I think it's going to be interesting to see what AMD managed to do to keep up and what Nvidia do with the other cards in the stack, as they will definitely be aimed more at the mainstream market. Let's see what that brings. For now, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you appreciate the monumental, huge amount of work that me and the team put into this, then consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you'll get access to all of the other cool testing data, among many other benefits. The link for that is down below. And remember, we'll be looking at a lot, and I mean a lot more games soon in further content, and maybe doing some head-to-head type stuff, which should be quite funny to look at and to obviously analyze. So make sure you're subscribed for that. And hopefully we get this back. It's here now, but it won't be by the end of the day. So yeah, with that, I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.